Somewhere in a gun store right now, someone is buying a pistol built on a mechanism invented before most American homes had electricity. It's still in production. It was still arming U.S. Special Operations units into this decade. And at one point, the Pentagon spent the better part of 40 years actively trying to retire it for good, and couldn't fully make it stick. That pistol is the Colt M1911. This is where it started, not as a design, but as a failure. A soldier empties his revolver into a man charging at him with a blade. 6 rounds, center mass. The man doesn't stop. He doesn't slow down, doesn't stumble. He closes the last few feet and puts steel into the soldier before anyone else can react. Thick brush, close range, no time to reload, no time to think. That wasn't a rumor from the front. It was showing up again and again in reports from American troops fighting in the Philippines in the early 1900s, up against Moro warriors who had a terrifying habit, refusing to go down on schedule. The fighters U.S. troops called juramentados prepared for these charges on purpose. They bound their limbs tight with cord to slow the bleeding. Some took stimulants before an attack. Many were driven by a religious conviction that made stopping non-negotiable. No amount of pain would end the fight early. The Army's standard sidearm, the Colt Model 1892 revolver, fired a .38 long Colt round. On paper, a perfectly reasonable military handgun. In the jungle, against men who had trained their bodies to keep coming, it wasn't stopping anybody. The Army's fix was almost embarrassing. Units went back into storage and pulled out an older weapon, the M1873 single-action Army revolver, chambered in the heavier .45 Colt cartridge. A gun that predated this war by 3 decades was outperforming the modern issue sidearm that was supposed to have replaced it, for one simple reason. It threw a bigger, slower piece of lead. That fact landed on the desk of General William Crozier, the Army's chief of ordnance, and it bothered him enough to order a real investigation. Not opinions from the field, data. In 1904, the Ordnance Department put together a 2-man board. Colonel John T. Thompson, the same man who would later design the weapon that made his name famous, the Thompson submachine gun, represented ordnance. Major Louis Lagarde, from the Army Medical Corps, brought the science. They set up at the Union stockyards in Chicago and tested 10 different handgun cartridges. Everything from the light 7.65mm and 9mm parabellum rounds through .38 long Colt and .38 ACP, up to .45 Colt in both blunt and hollow point form, the British .476 Ely and the .455 Webley. They fired into live cattle. They fired into human cadavers. They measured how far the impact threw or swung a body, using it as a rough stand-in for the question the Army actually needed answered. Which round could stop a man mid-charge, on the first hit, without needing a second or third shot to finish the job? No theory, no guesswork, just bodies, cartridges, and results. The conclusion wasn't subtle. In his report to the Ordnance Department, Thompson stated plainly that the new service pistol should not be of less than .45 caliber, and that it needed to be a real man-stopper. Nothing smaller would reliably do it. He also wanted it capable of well-directed rapid fire, which quietly ruled out leaning on old revolvers and pointed towards something newer, a self-loading pistol. That one line in a government report is the actual origin point of everything the M1911 would become. Not a blueprint, not a sketch on a napkin, a blunt medical and battlefield verdict. Build something that throws a .45 caliber bullet, and build it to fire fast. If you're into the engineering side of legendary firearms, and not just the history side, you're in the right place. Subscribe now, because the part where this requirement turns into an actual working pistol is where the story gets genuinely clever. There was just one problem. In 1904, that gun didn't exist yet. The Army had a mandate on paper and nothing to put in a holster. Revolvers in the new caliber were easy enough to build, but a revolver couldn't deliver the rate of fire Thompson wanted. Self-loading pistols existed too, but every .45 caliber prototype anyone had tried so far either jammed, kicked like a mule, or broke down under sustained fire. Colt's own first attempt, a modified Model 1902 chambered for the new round, failed almost immediately. The cartridge, adapted straight from the old .45 Colt revolver round, was too long to cycle reliably through a self-loading action. Whoever solved this wasn't just going to build a bigger gun. They were going to have to solve a mechanical problem nobody had cracked. How do you take the recoil of a battlefield .45 caliber round and tame it into something a soldier could rack, fire, and rack again fast enough to matter, without the whole mechanism tearing itself apart after a few hundred rounds? Colt already knew exactly who to call. Colt didn't call a stranger. They called John Moses Browning, a man who had already spent 2 decades solving mechanical problems most engineers considered unsolvable. He'd already given Winchester its most successful lever-action rifles. He'd already built the Auto 5, the first mass-produced semi-automatic shotgun. He'd already figured out how to make a machine gun run entirely on the force of its own recoil, no external power needed. By 1905, when Colt handed him the .45 caliber problem, Browning wasn't auditioning for the job. He was the only realistic candidate for it. The problem itself was brutal in its simplicity. A .45 caliber round hits with enough force to make blowback-operated pistols, the simple, popular design of the era, either dangerously unsafe or comically heavy. In a blowback gun, nothing holds the barrel and slide together during firing. Spring tension alone stands between the shooter's hand and a slide moving fast enough to hurt them. Scale that design up to handle a .45 caliber cartridge, and the springs needed would make the gun unmanageable if the breech didn't just blow open too early and injure the shooter first. Browning's answer was to lock the barrel and slide together for the first fraction of an inch of travel, then release them from each other at exactly the right moment. Other designers were solving the same problem with far more moving parts. The German Luger, for instance, used a jointed toggle mechanism that flexed like a knee, elegant to look at and finicky to keep clean in the field. Browning went the other direction. Fewer parts, cruder looking, almost impossible to break. Here's how it plays out on a single trigger pull. The instant the round fires, the barrel and slide move backward together, still locked. A small link, pinned to the frame at one end and to the underside of the barrel at the other, starts to rotate as the whole assembly travels rearward. After a short distance, that rotation pulls the rear of the barrel downward, and the locking lugs on top of the barrel disengage from matching grooves cut into the slide. The moment they separate, the barrel stops. The slide keeps moving alone, momentum carrying it back far enough to eject the spent case, before the recoil spring drags it forward again, stripping a fresh round from the magazine and guiding the barrel back up into lockup, ready for the next shot. The genius of it isn't the complexity. It's the opposite. The unlocking doesn't run on a spring rate someone guessed at or a timer bolted onto the gun. It runs on distance, the exact physical travel needed to let pressure inside the barrel drop to a safe level before the action opens. Fewer moving parts means fewer things that can jam, crack, or wear out, whether that's on a testing bench in Connecticut or, soon enough, buried in mud an ocean away. It's the kind of solution that looks obvious only after somebody else has already found it. Decades later, this same tilting barrel principle would end up inside nearly every serious modern service pistol on the market, from the Glock to the Sig Sauer. But in 1906, it was still just an idea waiting to be tested against the U.S. Army's harshest requirements. By 1906, the Army had a working requirement and, for the first time, real hardware to test against it. The trials themselves almost didn't happen on schedule. The Ordnance Department's own sample .45 caliber ammunition wasn't ready in time, pushing everything back months before a single shot was fired. 6 manufacturers submitted designs, Colt among them, alongside entries from Germany's DWM and Britain's Webley, plus a domestic rival from Savage Arms. One by one, the field narrowed, until it came down to 2 guns on the same table. Browning's design out of Colt, and a rival semi-automatic from Savage. What followed was less a test and more an interrogation. Over 2 days, each pistol was made to fire 6,000 rounds, thousands beyond anything either gun would ever see in a soldier's holster. When Colt's pistol ran hot enough to become dangerous to keep loading, the testing officers didn't stop the trial. They dunked the entire gun in water to cool it down, dried it off, and kept firing. It didn't jam. It didn't crack. It didn't need a single part replaced. Browning, by most accounts, was there to watch it happen. On March 29, 1911, the U.S. Army made it official, adopting Browning's design as the model of 1911. The Navy and Marine Corps followed within 2 years, standardizing the same pistol across every branch that carried a sidearm. A mechanical answer to a battlefield failure was now standard-issue equipment for the most powerful military on Earth. But a written specification and a trophy from a testing floor prove exactly one thing: that a gun can survive a controlled trial designed by the same people who built it. It hadn't survived a war yet, and within 3 years, it was going to get one. 3 years later, it got its war. By 1917, American troops were carrying the M1911 into trenches on the Western Front. Mud, cold, gas, weeks without a proper cleaning kit. Everything the Connecticut testing floor couldn't simulate, the trenches provided for free. The pistol that had survived 6,000 rounds and a dunk in clean water now had to survive something worse. Months of neglect in the filthiest fighting conditions in modern history. It held up. Not perfectly, nothing does, but well enough that nobody in the Army seriously questioned the design itself when the war ended. The stopping power that had been so hard to prove on cattle and cadavers back in Chicago now had a different kind of witness. Soldiers who'd used it at arm's length against an enemy in the same trench. What they questioned was the fit. Soldiers came home with the same complaint over and over. The pistol bit them, literally. The curve of the grip left a gap at the top of the backstrap, and under recoil, the hammer's spur would catch the web of skin between thumb and forefinger. Men with smaller hands struggled to reach the trigger cleanly. The tiny front and rear sights, adequate on a calm testing range, were nearly useless for a fast target picture under stress. None of this meant the mechanism was wrong. It meant the mechanism was wearing the wrong clothes. Between 1923 and 1926, the Army worked through a list of fixes with the gun, not inside it. A shorter, wider trigger brought the reach in for more hands. An arched mainspring housing curved the backstrap outward, pushing the web of the hand down and out of the hammer's path. Relief cuts behind the trigger guard gave trigger fingers room they hadn't had before. Wider sights replaced the old pinpricks. The result was renamed the M1911A1, and underneath every one of those changes, Browning's original locking geometry from 1905 sat completely untouched. Nobody had found a reason to fix what wasn't broken. Then came a war that would test something Browning never had to think about: whether a weapon built on precision machining could survive being built by companies that had never made a firearm in their lives. When Pearl Harbor pulled the United States into the Second World War, Colt alone couldn't come close to meeting demand. The company was already buried in machine gun contracts. So the government went looking elsewhere, and what it found was almost absurd. Remington Rand, a company that made typewriters, took on an M1911A1 contract and ended up producing more of the pistol than anyone else in the war, nearly 900,000 units, over half of everything built during the conflict, outproducing Colt itself by a wide margin. Ithaca, better known for hunting shotguns, turned out roughly 340,000. Union Switch and Signal, a firm that built railroad signaling equipment, delivered 55,000. Singer, the sewing machine company, only ever made 500. Their tooling turned out to be so precise, it was worth more building bomb sights than pistols. And the government pulled them off the contract almost as soon as it started. It wasn't seamless. In 1943, Remington Rand had to halt its own production line for weeks after discovering that parts from different subcontractors weren't interchangeable enough to guarantee a working gun. A real crack in the assumption that any factory could just build this thing. But the crack got patched, not because the design changed, but because the tolerances Browning had built into it in the first place were forgiving enough to fix on the fly. That's the part worth sitting with. A sewing machine company and a railroad signal manufacturer, with zero firearms experience between them, tooled up and built a lethal, combat-reliable pistol inside a matter of months, off the same drawings a gunmaker would have used. By the time the guns stopped rolling off wartime production lines, the US government had bought roughly 2.7 million of them across its full service life, and the exact locking geometry inside every single one traced back, unchanged, to a link and a barrel that first tilted downward on a test range in 1906. The gun went on to serve through Korea and then Vietnam without another redesign. Decades of jungle heat, monsoon mud, and rice paddy grit run through the same mechanism that had already survived a world war and a factory floor staffed by typewriter assemblers. 3 wars deep, and the core of the pistol hadn't changed once. But by the early 1970s, the world around the gun had. A single-stack magazine holding 7 rounds was starting to look thin next to what other countries were putting in soldiers' hands. A trigger with no safety mechanism beyond a soldier's own discipline was starting to look, to some people in Washington, less like a feature and more like a liability waiting to happen. The pistol that had never lost a fight was about to face an enemy no locking mechanism could outmaneuver: a budget committee. It started small. In 1977, the Air Force asked Congress for funding to fix a problem with its own ammunition. A run of defective rounds for its Smith & Wesson revolvers kept causing catastrophic failures, forcing entire lots to be pulled from service. That modest request triggered a much bigger question, and when investigators went looking, they found the U.S. military had more than 24 different handgun models in active inventory, chambered for more than 100 different types of ammunition. No coordination, no shared parts, no shared logistics chain. In an alliance built around standardized supply lines, that wasn't just untidy anymore. It was a liability nobody could defend on paper. The fix Congress demanded was standardization. 1 pistol, 1 caliber, across every branch. And the caliber wasn't going to be .45. NATO had already settled on 9x19mm as its standard sidearm round years earlier, and the alliance wanted every member nation's pistol able to run on everyone else's ammunition on a shared battlefield. The new requirements went further. A magazine holding at least 13 rounds, nearly double what the M1911 carried, and a double-action trigger that could be carried safely with a round already chambered, something the M1911's single-action design, dependent entirely on its manual safety and a soldier's own discipline, was never built to do. The Air Force ran the first round of trials and picked a winner in 1980, the Beretta 92S1. The Army, unwilling to let another branch choose its sidearm for it, refused to accept the result and insisted on running its own competition the following year. Then, in 1982, the Army abruptly canceled its own trial, citing reliability failures, and released almost nothing to explain what those failures actually were. The press smelled a story. Headlines started asking whether the whole process had been mishandled, and Congress got dragged back in, wanting to know why a simple procurement decision had turned into a 4-year mess. A third round of testing, the XM9 trials, ran through 1983 and 1984. The same handguns, largely the same competitors, but now under a level of scrutiny that bordered on hostile after 2 straight rounds of accusations. Beretta's design, now refined into the 92F, won again, this time decisively enough that nobody could credibly contest it. On January 14, 1985, the Department of Defense made it official. The Beretta 92F was adopted as the M9, the new standard sidearm of the United States military. 74 years after the Army first accepted Browning's design, it was gone, on paper. In practice, a surprising number of people simply refused to let it die. Marine Force reconnaissance units kept building M1911s out of old parts, hand-fitting frames and slides from World War II production runs, because they didn't trust the M9's smaller 9mm round to do what the old .45 had always done. Army Special Forces did much the same. The FBI's hostage rescue team adopted a customized M1911 as standard issue, and never looked back. Delta Force operators carried them by choice, not by requisition. Even the Los Angeles Police Department's SWAT unit built its own armory of hand-tuned 1911s. None of this was nostalgia. Every one of these was a working professional, choosing an obsolete design over its official replacement, for the exact reason the pistol had been built in the first place: stopping power at close range on the first hit. That quiet resistance eventually turned into something official. In 2012, the Marine Corps signed a contract with Colt for a brand new production run. Not a museum piece, not surplus, but freshly manufactured M1911 pattern pistols, updated with a dual recoil spring system, an accessory rail, and modern night sights. They called it the M45A1, and they issued it to Force Reconnaissance, Marine Corps Special Operations Command, and the Corps' most specialized units. 27 years after its own funeral, the U.S. government was cutting a fresh production order for the same locking mechanism Browning had drawn up in 1905. It couldn't last forever. In 2019, the Marine Corps selected the Sig Sauer M18 to replace nearly everything else in its handgun inventory, the M45A1 included. The rollout took 3 years. By October 2022, the last M45A1s were pulled from active units, and with them went the final official military use of the M1911 platform in United States service. 111 years after the design was first adopted, and 37 years after Washington had already tried, once, to bury it. The military chapter of this story is finished, but a gun doesn't stop existing just because the government stops signing the checks. And what happens to a legendary weapon once the last uniform stops carrying it is a different question entirely. The answer to that one isn't sitting in the Pentagon. It's sitting on gun store shelves, in competition holsters, and in custom shops that have been building this exact mechanism by hand for longer than most of their customers have been alive. The reason gun stores are still selling this design in 2026 traces back to a legal technicality nobody was thinking about in 1911. Patents expire. Browning's original patents on the M1911 began running out starting in 1928, decades before the military ever considered giving the gun up. From that point forward, the exact mechanical blueprint Browning had drawn for Colt was legally available to any manufacturer on Earth who wanted to build it. Colt no longer owned the idea, it just still owned the name. At first, nothing much happened with that fact. Colt was still the only company anyone associated with the pistol, and the military was still buying millions of them. But after the Second World War, something shifted that had nothing to do with patents. Millions of men came home having trained on, carried, and trusted this exact pistol under fire, and a large number of them wanted to own the same gun in civilian life. Add a flood of cheap, surplus .45 ACP ammunition left over from wartime production, and the M1911 had something almost no other military sidearm gets: an enormous built-in customer base that already knew how to use it, wanting it for reasons that had nothing to do with the Army's procurement office. That civilian demand didn't stay passive for long. For decades, the M1911 was the default platform in bullseye pistol competition, a discipline built entirely around precision at distance, not the gun's original job description at all, but proof the mechanism was accurate enough to be trusted for something the Army never asked it to do. Then, starting in the 1970s and 80s, a new discipline arrived: practical shooting, built around speed as much as accuracy, and a handful of gunsmiths saw an opportunity nobody else had. Armin Swenson and Bob Marvel started hand-fitting M1911 slides and frames to tolerances tighter than any factory would attempt. Bill Wilson, a competitive shooter frustrated with what factories were selling, started building his own, and eventually turned that hobby into Wilson Combat, one of the most respected custom gun houses in the country. Guns coming out of these shops were being tuned to put 5 shots inside 2 inches at 50 yards, a level of accuracy nobody testing this pistol in 1906 had any reason to expect from it. That culture never went away. It multiplied. It also never left the screen. Decades after the Army stopped issuing it, the M1911 silhouette kept showing up everywhere pop culture needed a pistol that looked serious. War dramas set in the trenches and jungles it actually served in. Action films where the hero needed something that read as both classic and lethal at a glance. Most viewers couldn't name the mechanism inside it. They just recognized the shape, the same way people recognize a shape they've been seeing for over a century without ever asking why it hasn't changed. Walk into virtually any gun shop in the United States today, and the M1911 pattern is still on the shelf, spanning a price range that stretches from budget builders like Rock Island Armory and Thesis, through mid-tier factory guns from Springfield and Colt itself, up to boutique houses, Wilson Combat, Nighthawk Custom, Ed Brown, Les Baer, where a single pistol can cost more than a used car and takes a single gunsmith weeks to hand fit. At the very top end, a company called Cabot Guns builds M1911s with grips carved from mammoth bone or plated in gold, selling the same century-old lockup mechanism as a luxury object. And in 2025, the story closed a loop nobody was expecting. The Civilian Marksmanship Program, the same government body that oversees the sale of old military surplus firearms to American citizens, resumed selling surplus M1911 and M1911A1 pistols, the actual guns that once served in uniform, and raised the lifetime purchase limit from 2 to 4 per customer. 114 years after the Army first adopted this design, and 40 years after Washington spent a decade trying to phase it out, the US government is still the one putting the original object directly into civilian hands. If you've made it this far through the whole story, subscribe, because that's exactly the kind of arc this channel exists to dig up. The object that should have quietly disappeared, and didn't. Because that's really what this whole story comes down to. A revolver failed in a jungle. A .45 caliber mandate got written into a government report. A mechanical engineer solved a problem nobody else could, with a piece of steel that swings on a link. 2 world wars, a congressional standardization order, a formal military retirement, and 40 years of the Pentagon actively trying to make it obsolete. And the locking geometry drawn up before most American homes had electricity is still, right now, the most copied handgun mechanism on the planet, and one of the best-selling pistol patterns in the country. Some designs get replaced. This one just got a bigger audience.